The yearly pulsing of Earth's biosphere is like the heartbeat of the planet, and it's been beating for a long time. The Gaian timescale that I've been developing in this video series lets us conceptualize the scope of geologic history by fitting 80 of these heartbeat years into a minute, 4,800 years into an hour, 115,000 years into a day, 806,000 years into a week, and 42 million years into one Gaian year. On this scale, the Earth itself is 108 years old. That's still a lot of time to try to visualize, so let's compare it to another organism that lives for hundreds of years: trees, whose lifespan can be observed through their sequence of growth rings. Here, I've drawn all 108 Gaian years since the formation of the Earth as a series of concentric circles. But remember, each one of these circles represents the passage of 42 million human years. Visualizing the history of the Earth this way also reminds us that even though we know a lot more about the more recent past, as represented by the larger circumference of the outer rings, the world depicted by that knowledge didn't come out of nowhere. It depends on the long sequence of events that came before, in much the same way that each growth ring of a tree is laid down on top of the layer grown the previous year. So what were the first few Gaian years like? The Earth formed, along with the rest of the solar system, through accretion out of the protoplanetary disk, but this was not a gentle process. Around 107 Gaian years ago, a Mars-sized planetary body dubbed Theia slammed into the newly formed Earth and ejected enough debris into orbit to eventually form the Moon. Much of the Earth's surface would have been molten rock at this time, but there is some evidence that a solid crust and liquid water oceans were beginning to form as early as 105 to 102 Gaian years ago. Still, this was a pretty hellish time, with surface temperatures above 200 degrees Celsius, a heavy carbon dioxide and methane-dominated atmosphere, constant volcanic activity, and frequent asteroid impacts. For this reason, the time period from the formation of the Earth up to around 95 Gaian years ago is called the Hadean Eon. Despite the inhospitable environment, genetic analysis suggests that life may have begun soon after the giant impact that formed the Moon, and remnants of possibly biogenic material and structures have been dated from 102 to 97 Gaian years ago. No true fossils exist from this time, but if this trace evidence is correct, these early microorganisms likely established the Earth's first ecosystems around hydrothermal vents, putting the very beginning of the biosphere, when Gaia's heart can be said to first start beating, at around a Gaian century ago. The next stage of Gaia's life extends from 95 Gaian years ago to around 60 Gaian years ago, and is referred to as the Archean Eon. The surface temperature had cooled somewhat, and the continental crust had been formed, but was largely covered by a global ocean save for a few islands. The early Archean still saw frequent asteroid impacts, with a particularly severe period known as the Late Heavy Bombardment likely peaking around 93 Gaian years ago. It was only after this point that early microbial life could expand beyond the hydrothermal vents and colonize the seas, adapting to a new energy source, sunlight, by developing a rudimentary form of photosynthesis relying on electrons from dissolved hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide as early as 90 Gaian years ago. This enabled the growth of dense communities, leading to the first identifiable fossil evidence of life at around 83 Gaian years ago in the form of shallow water microbial mats called stromatolites. From among these early solar-powered prokaryotes, a lineage would emerge that would turn out to have profound consequences for the entire Earth, with the evolution of cyanobacteria somewhere around 70 Gaian years ago, which had the unique ability to split water into hydrogen and oxygen in order to provide the electrons needed to turbocharge photosynthesis. The excess toxic oxygen produced as a byproduct of this process was limited at first, and quickly consumed by chemical reactions with dissolved iron. Essentially, the oceans rusted and turned red. But by the end of the Archean, most of the iron was gone, cyanobacteria had multiplied across the globe, and the stage was set for a dramatic change in the environmental conditions of both the ocean and the atmosphere as a new eon began, the Proterozoic eon, a long stretch of time lasting from 60 Gaian years ago all the way to 13 Gaian years ago. At the beginning of the Proterozoic, with the oceanic iron depleted, the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere began to rise, starting around 58 Gaian years ago and stabilizing around 9 Gaian years later, with oxygen levels at roughly 10% of what they are today. Many of the bacterial species that had evolved in an anaerobic environment went extinct in what has become known as the Great Oxidation Event. But cyanobacteria survived, having evolved a tolerance to their own oxygen waste product, and other bacteria evolved to metabolize oxygen itself via aerobic respiration. The excess oxygen in the atmosphere converted the powerful greenhouse gas methane into less potent carbon dioxide, which reduced global temperatures and kicked off a series of ice ages known as the Huronian glaciations around 54 Gaian years ago. Somewhere in the midst of all this turmoil, perhaps around 52 to 50 Gaian years ago, something remarkable happened within the lineage of microorganisms distinct from bacteria known as archaea. An archaeon engulfed one of the new oxygen-metabolizing bacteria and developed a symbiotic relationship with it, resulting in the first cells with mitochondria, in other words, the first eukaryotes, which would go on to become the ancestors to all algae, plants, fungi, a wide variety of protists, and of course, animals. It's worth taking a moment to pause here and notice that we're about halfway through the century-long history of life on this planet, and we're only now seeing the emergence of more complex single-celled organisms, with a greater degree of internal structure in the eukaryotes. It's probably not an accident that this only occurred after the widespread oxygenation of the oceans, not only because aerobic metabolism is so much more efficient, but also because the mass extinction of so many anaerobic prokaryotes produced a strong selective pressure for a novel kind of organism that could thrive in the newly oxygenated environment. However, it would still take many Gaian years for eukaryotes to unlock the full potential of their newfound complexity and evolve into macroscopic, fully multicellular organisms. Oxygen levels remained quite low relative to today, and trace elements required as nutrients were periodically scarce. These conditions, while harsh enough to prevent the widespread ascendance of eukaryotes, may have encouraged them to diversify into the many different lineages we see today. For example, the last common ancestor of all photosynthesizing eukaryotes, such as plants and algae, likely lived around 45 Gaian years ago, when an early eukaryote engulfed a cyanobacterium and co-opted it into becoming the first chloroplast. A completely separate lineage of eukaryotes would eventually produce the last common ancestor of animals and fungi, which lived around 35 Gaian years ago. At this time, all these species were either unicellular microorganisms much like today's protists, or perhaps loose aggregates like slime molds with at most a handful of cell types. But their descendants would each independently hit upon the same strategy of increasing cellular specialization that would lead to the development of complex, truly multicellular life forms, which begin to appear in the fossil record around 25 Gaian years ago, namely a variety of red algae recognizably similar to a species that still exists today. This entire eukaryotic evolutionary history would have taken place in the oceans, because the continents at this time resembled the surface of the moon, all bare rock and shifting sands, with no organic material to constitute soil, save perhaps a thin microbial film here and there. But all of that would change when the algae-like ancestors of today's plants and the earliest multicellular fungi began to colonize the land around 23 Gaian years ago. Perhaps as a consequence, or maybe just due to the inevitable saturation of oxygen reservoirs in the ocean and seafloor, oxygen levels in the atmosphere began to rise again starting at around 20 Gaian years ago, which would in turn encourage the development of more complex organisms with higher rates of aerobic respiration. Although fossil evidence is scarce, genetic studies and biomarker remnants suggest that the first true animals evolved around 18 Gaian years ago. Pretty quickly, however, these putative early animals would have been forced to adapt to harsh conditions, as a series of glaciations nearly covered the globe in ice at least twice between 17 and 15 Gaian years ago, a period known technically as the Sturtian and Marinoan glaciations, and poetically as Snowball Earth, perhaps the most severe ice ages the Earth has ever seen. But after the ice had thawed, a variety of complex aquatic life, including animals, thrived during a period known as the Ediacaran, with a remarkably preserved set of soft-bodied macroscopic organisms, most of them unlike anything alive today, discernible in the fossil record from 14 Gaian years ago to the end of the Proterozoic around 13 Gaian years ago. This brings us to the dawn of the current eon of Earth's history, known as the Phanerozoic. It may only cover the most recent 13 Gaian years out of a century of life on this planet, but with relatively large, multicellular organisms finally on the scene, the fossil record of this eon is much more comprehensive and diverse, so it is convenient to divide it up into 3 eras. The first is called the Paleozoic era, and it lasted for the first half of the Phanerozoic eon, up to around 6 Gaian years ago. It started with a dramatic increase in the diversity of the fossil record, known as the Cambrian explosion, which saw animals develop the first exoskeletons and other mineralized tissues that fossilize well. The earliest vertebrates also date to this time period, with the first fish showing up around 12 Gaian years ago. The first true land plants, something like today's mosses and liverworts, evolved around 11 Gaian years ago, with the first vascular plants showing up around 10 Gaian years ago. This turned the surface into a viable habitat for animals to occupy, and in particular, around 9 Gaian years ago, a branch of 4-limbed fishes became the first tetrapods, adapted at least partially for life on land. Around 8 Gaian years ago, these tetrapods diversified into amphibians on the one hand and amniotes on the other, amniotes being the ancestral grouping that includes today's mammals, reptiles, and birds. The amniotes had evolved the ability to reproduce on dry land by laying eggs with tough shells that could prevent them from drying out, a strategy that would become crucial to their success around 7 Gaian years ago with the decline of the great global rainforest and the transition to a more arid environment. By then, the amniotes had also diverged into the synapsids, ancestral to today's mammals, and the sauropsids, ancestral to today's reptiles and birds. One branch of sauropsids in particular would eventually evolve into dinosaurs, but at first it was actually the synapsids, our own ancestors among them, who were more successful and dominated the landscape of the late Paleozoic. But this hierarchy wouldn't last long. The Paleozoic ended 6 Gaian years ago in the worst mass extinction event on record, when a large portion of what is now Siberia exploded in the biggest volcanic eruption of the entire Phanerozoic eon. A massive amount of carbon dioxide was released into the atmosphere. Global temperatures spiked, the oceans acidified, and food webs collapsed, wiping out 81% of all marine species and 70% of all terrestrial species, a calamity colloquially known as the Great Dying. This very nearly reset the Earth back to the microbial world of the Proterozoic, but enough complex multicellular species survived that eventually ecosystems recovered, albeit fundamentally changed. This transition marked the beginning of the second of the Phanerozoic's 3 eras, known as the Mesozoic era. Now it was the sauropsids' turn to rule the terrestrial world, with the first dinosaurs and pterosaurs beginning to appear in the fossil record. This forced the remaining synapsids either to go extinct or to adapt to the role of diminutive nocturnal insectivores, resulting in a small group of endothermic species that can arguably be called the first mammals around 5 Gaian years ago. Dinosaurs, on the other hand, diversified into many different forms, and around 4 Gaian years ago, one lineage in particular began to evolve sophisticated feathers, perhaps originally for insulation and mating displays, and later co-opted to enable flight, making these avian dinosaurs the direct ancestors of all modern birds. In the plant world, a revolutionary change occurred around 3 Gaian years ago, when flowering plants suddenly appear in the fossil record and quickly spread across the globe. This dramatic increase in plant diversity and the insects that evolved to pollinate them may have spurred a corresponding diversification of mammal lineages around 2 Gaian years ago, For instance, this may be when the first primates emerged, as mentioned in my previous video, and the first hoofed mammals show up in the fossil record around the same time. This early evolutionary radiation may have somewhat prepared the mammals for the disaster that was to come. Around 1.5 Gaian years ago, a 10-kilometer wide asteroid slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, forming the Chicxulub crater and ejecting more than 50,000 cubic kilometers of debris into the atmosphere. To make matters worse, the impact happened to strike an area of carbonate rock rich in hydrocarbons and sulfates. The resulting dust, soot, and aerosols smothered the planet in darkness for years, and once again acidified the oceans, causing ecological collapse and a mass extinction that killed 3/4 of all plant and animal species on Earth, including the non-avian dinosaurs, whose diversity had been declining even before the impact. Smaller species were more likely to survive, which may explain why birds, mammals, and small reptiles such as lizards and snakes were able to recover and diversify into many newly available evolutionary niches. This cataclysm ended the Mesozoic, leading to the third and current era of the Phanerozoic eon, named the Cenozoic. The geologic and evolutionary changes that occurred over the course of this last year and a half eventually produced the world we know today. As I discussed in more detail in my previous video, the last Gaian year in particular saw a gradual drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide and a corresponding cooling of the planet from the greenhouse world of the early Cenozoic, marked at first by the appearance of ice sheets in Antarctica and eventually transitioning to the current icehouse climate. This new climatic system is sometimes referred to as the Late Cenozoic Ice Age, and it culminates in the periodic glaciations that have become more pronounced over the course of the last Gaian month, as I covered in more detail previously. So here we are in the present day, finally in a position to appreciate our place in Gaia's long history. If we're lucky, we can hope to inhabit one brief Gaian minute in our lives, sharing that minute with all the diverse plants, animals, fungi, and more that fill the ecosystems around us. Looking back, this biosphere is most directly the product of the Cenozoic's year and a half of geologic and evolutionary development since the last great mass extinction. But our world wasn't starting from a blank slate even then. We are also the inheritors of the 5 Gaian years of the Mesozoic before that, which shaped the course of mammal evolution in the shadow of the dinosaurs, and the 7 Gaian years of the Paleozoic before that, which gave us fish and plants and the 4-limbed body plan. And all this complexity is a result of the advances in self-structure and multicellular organization that came out of the 47 Gaian years of the Proterozoic, which in turn owed its oxygenated oceans to the photosynthetic innovations of cyanobacteria during the 35 Gaian years of the Archean. The roots of the tree of life stretch back 100 Gaian years into the depths of the Hadean, and we are only now starting to understand just how much our planet has changed in the course of that century. From the biosphere's origin in small communities of microbes huddling around hydrothermal vents to a world of towering forests and open plains and coral reefs teeming with life. And every year, the seasons change, the cycle of growth and decay begins anew, and Gaia's heart beats one more time.